Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I'm the founder at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm where we focus on solving Africa's complex development challenges. Now, Nigeria's security challenges are real. They've morphed from, basically armed robbery to terrorism, insurgency, and really widespread conflict between cattle headers and farmers, which appears to be the big issues countrywide. But I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. According to the Nextier Violent Conflicts Database, in the 12 months leading to April 2025, Nigeria has recorded about 919 violent conflict incidents, resulting in about 4,824 casualties. And by casualties, we mean dead, injured, and kidnapped. Now, these incidents are about 16% lower, than the preceding 12 months in terms of incidents, and they're about 26% lower in the preceding period as well in terms of casualties. Now, today's guest is one of Africa's leading scholars in the security and defense space. Akali Omeni is the founder and principal consultant at Terrorism Studies Consultancy. He was formerly the founder and co-chair of the Africa Research Group at the University of Leicester and co-chair of the Africa Research and holds a PhD in Defense Studies from King's College. He's the author of 4 books, Policing and Politics in Nigeria, A Comprehensive History, Insurgency and War in Nigeria, Regional Fracture and the Fight Against Boko Haram, and Counter-Insurgency in Nigeria, the Military and Operations Against Boko Haram. I believe the 4th book, which is due out in August of this year, is Picking Sides, Race, Ethnicity, and Recruitment in Colonial Nigerian Army. Our research also shows that there's another book in the works, Rebel. We're eager to, read these books. Omeni, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Patrick. I think these conversations are really important. Building a critical mass of ideas around not just what's wrong security-wise with Nigeria, but potentially how to form a team of teams of people to gradually, over time, address these issues. So thank you very much for having me.
Exactly, a community of practice. And that community of practice is evolving, it's forming, and your books have been central, to the discussions, happening in these spaces. And you've tried to help us unpack many of the fundamental issues that we face, and I hope we can do that on this call. Now, if we start by looking at policing and politics in Nigeria, and just ask you to help us understand where we are and how we got here. I mean, in the book, you examined the history of the Nigerian Police Force from the colonial era to date, and how, maybe some of the British imperial policing shaped what we have today. So if you can help, just, briefly help us unpack how our history, kind of shaped where we are today with Nigerian policing.
I mean, the Nigerian Police Force is it's a complex institution. I think they use that word to describe certain kinds of organizations and people today, but I think it applies to Nigerian Police Force because it really has gone through so many changes over its history. It's a force that's ubiquitous across the country, whereas you might not see a military formation in the most remote areas of Nigeria, you would always see at least one Nigeria Police Force formation. So a very broad spread indeed. The origins go way back. If we go back to that colonial architect of Nigeria called Lord Frederick Deltry Lugard, when he first arrived in 1897, he wasn't convinced that natives, I use the words natives, not in a pejorative sense, but in the way they kind of viewed the indigenous people who were on the ground at that time. Lugard didn't believe that, initially at least, that Nigerians were the best folks to kind of police their own territories. And this is a story that's true but not very well known. He actually brought an Indian group, an Indian company. It's called the Madras Company to Nigeria into Lokoja in 1897 because he was convinced. Lugard was born in India, some background, and so he had a very strong connection with the country. He also served there in the British Army. He felt that. Indian police personnel might actually be military personnel, I should say, might be better suited to police Nigeria. But they spent all of 1 week in Nigeria and they just couldn't do it. And so he decided very quickly that, right, we'll need to assemble a Nigerian regiment. And so the Madras Regiment was a very short-lived part of the Nigerian Police Force history. And so this force that was formed for colonial interests, right? There wasn't a consensus around how it was formed in terms of bringing the local people together to say, right, what do you want of a police force? It was formed primarily to protect British interests, right? And this was something that endured right from the colony of Lagos when the original consulate force was formed, through to the expeditions in northern Nigeria in 1903 when Lugard kind of annexed that region in the name of the British Crown. The police continue to play this very punitive role in these campaigns. And I think that when we came to independence in 1960, I believe there was a real opportunity for us to ask questions around what kind of police force we wanted, right? Almost a real sense that we could depart from having a force to a service, right? Insofar as the British interests that the police force now served were now gradually being divested from those of Nigeria, right? Nigerians were plotting their own future. That conversation sadly never happened. And as we also know, even if there was a space for that conversation around the reform of policing to happen, the coup d'etats of 1966 completely derailed Nigeria's future. And so by the time we had the kind of odious period of a military interregnum in Nigeria, where the military was in charge for so long, as we know, Patrick, things never really moved ahead for the police. And in fact, what I argue in my book is that the military, in some ways, undermined policing in Nigeria, just by the fact that the kind of superordinate power in the country wasn't democratically elected, and the police is meant to serve a democratically elected superordinate. And so it was dysfunction from the start. And I'm not convinced that dysfunction has been completely addressed even today.
Just as an aside, why did the Indians leave after a week?
The mosquitoes.
Right?
Some people assume that a lot of the diseases we have in tropical Africa might also be applicable to maybe tropical parts of Asia, but not really. Malaria, for instance, we have a very virulent form of malaria. Yeah, and I think our mosquitoes are quite special in their own right. Add that to all kinds of local challenges, the language gap, and so on and so forth. I think Lugard viewed the kind of romanticized idea of an Indian regiment in Nigeria through a more dim view after just a week or so.
Interesting. Now, what are some of these colonial legacies that may still be affecting policing in Nigeria?
First and foremost, I think, is the idea that the police was there to support the interests of the superordinate, as opposed to the interests of the civilian population. As an example, if you had, for instance, a white colonial official commit a crime in the past, and the expectation from the police wouldn't be to kind of investigate that crime per se. It would be almost to try to gaslight the local people who have reported the crime, right? To make it seem as though, no, you haven't gotten this right. This person is right. You are wrong. And we still see shades of that today, whereby even in supposedly clear and cut cases where you would feel that the police would take the side of the person who maybe reported the case, there are still several cases where someone reports a case to the police and they are then kind of detained if the person they are making a report against is a big man.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. Now, one of the other points you raised in the book is the arguments around how to shape the police, especially around independence. So one of the core arguments at the time was, should policing be centralized, or should it be decentralized? And we know how that went, but it was really a contentious issue, especially in the independence era. What were some of these other competing visions? And now, with benefit of hindsight, did we make the right choices at that time? And this question is critical because there are big arguments that are happening today around state policing, etc., that gets one to start thinking about those origin debates, that we had. Where do you fall on, these different arguments?
Okay, I'll come to the state policing in a minute, but in terms of the kind of salient discussions around the Nigerian Police Force at independence, I think one of the key ones was the issue of Nigerianization. Now, as some background, from the 1930s, some of Nigeria's earliest parliamentarians, including J. Akilade Kolkrik, they were taken aback by the fact that whereas the Nigeria Police Force still had a very high number of British personnel, there wasn't a sense that the British were keen on kind of progressing indigenous Nigerians through the ranks. The question was first raised in 1933 and 1932, but it was kind of put aside for quite some time. As you know, in a few years after that, there was the outbreak of the Second World War. And so these conversations around Nigerianization, which the likes of Azikiwe led at the time, there was almost a kind of tacit agreement between those pushing for Nigerianization of all the institutions and independence as part of that process, between them and the British administration, that look, a world war is in progress now. We need to kind of put these things aside and get rid of Hitler, and help us kind of mobilize the people to fight this war. And when we are done, we can revisit this conversation. And the British, they kept the award. And when the war was over, Nigerianization kind of then picked up pace. And it was a process whereby people who were indigenous Nigerians were then given an opportunity to progress through the ranks. And this was really important because otherwise, in just a few years, 15 years from the end of the Second World War, you might have had a situation whereby Nigeria was independent, but most of the senior police personnel were still white British. The issue with Nigerianization, Patrick, was that it watered down the requirements. It watered down the requirements to enter the police force and to participate at all levels, right? Initially, the conversation around Nigerianization was along the lines of, well, if there was a qualified Nigerian, right, that was able to fill a position, then they should fill the position. However, if the Nigerians applying for that position were not up to the qualifications or standard of their British counterparts, then the British should fill that position. Now, because we didn't have that many, relatively speaking, educated Nigerians by the 1940s and even into the early 1950s, that simply wasn't possible. So these requirements had to be watered down. And this kind of started one of the very regrettable kind of features of federal institutions in Nigeria, which is that what you could call substandard people were then kind of filtered into the force. And regrettably, I don't think that necessarily has been addressed completely up until today. So that's a major issue. And when you understand that these are folks who are going to carry guns on the streets, and you haven't really given, proper thought into who you are recruiting into those roles, then aren't you setting yourself up for all kinds of, issues and daily indiscretions of the force? That's the point about Nigerianization. The other point that you rightly raised was about the centralization or decentralization. Initially, the Northern Police Force was its own entity. You had the police force within the colony of Lagos, again, its own entity, Southern Police Force. But these were all kind of amalgamated as well by the time, by the 1930s as well. There was this kind of sense that everything had to come together. Now, not everyone was happy about this, but the argument was that a centralized police force was going to be more effective in terms of being resourced, in terms of rules and regulations, in terms of simple things such as the accoutrements and even the police outfits and so on. It would all be uniform, right? Yep. And this it seemed like a sound idea at the time. I'm not sure that it's any less sound. I don't think the issue is state police per se. I think it's something that I hope we get to a bit later on, which is the welfare of the men and women who serve in these forces. So look, even if you have a decentralized police force and every state had their own police force, if you don't think critically about the welfare of these men and women, you will still have issues, I think.
And we'll get to that discussion, which is at the heart of what we're trying to explore. After we've kind of built the context around it. And one of the other contextual questions is how did our successive military regimes shape the structure and the nature and the philosophy of the Nigeria Police Force? And how has that kind of impacted the way they conduct their affairs today, being that we spend these many years, under military rule?
I mean, going back to that very shabby chapter of Nigerian history, which some people might view through rose-tinted glasses, but many of us who lived in that era would probably take a different view. Look, I'm sure, well, personally, I don't recall having seen a police administrator of a state. It was normally a military administrator, right? There might have been one or two policemen. I'm not sure. I'm speculating now, but for the most part, even the Supreme Military Councils never had police personnel there. The point I'm trying to make is that the military was the superordinate, right? I don't think the police institution was confused about its role in society. They were below the military and they served at its behest. Right now, if you have that military force which isn't democratically elected, if you have that military force that effectively acts against constitutional requirements, then how do you expect the police force to be functional as opposed to being dysfunctional? Effectively, we had this era of Nigeria's history where the constitution was put aside. Right. Even in instances where the failed Third Republic, where you kind of had this, you had civilian state governors, but then you had an overall military head in Babangida. You look at that whole era, and you also understand that actually even the ministers and they all worked at the behest of the military. So it wasn't even a civilian era per se. The only time we really came back to civilian rule wasn't up until 1999 when Obasanjo came back. It was really from that point that the police had its first real chance to kind of breathe some air to say, okay, now we are back to kind of democratic rule. What do we do about ourselves? Military rule undermined the police force and so many other institutions in Nigeria. I wouldn't say irreparably, because I believe, and this is a personal philosophy, that no matter how bad things are, they don't need to get worse and they can always get better, right? So I wouldn't say it's been irreparably damaged, but I would say that the damage has been quite severe. Right. And it's also to the culture and the ethos of these groups, because when you see military personnel ruling by the barrel of a gun, right, Patrick, because that's what happens during military rule. The military men can smile, they can have meetings with civilians and be very polite in those meetings, but we all know the subtext of what's going on there. These folks are ruling by the barrel of the gun. And when the police force have to serve kind of that government and they kind of see that military men can be very coercive, they can be very brutal, they can be murderous in some instances. It sets a very bad example for the police.
And we'll come back to many of these issues, but I wanted to shift a little bit to the military, and which is a subject you've written on quite extensively. And as someone who So let me assume that I'm not really involved in the security community and the discussions around it. I'm just an ordinary Nigerian sitting on the sidelines watching what's been happening in the last 2 decades. It would baffle me that a Nigerian military, the same military that fought in Ecomog and brought peace to Liberia, Sierra Leone, etc., found it difficult, near impossible, to disband a ragtag Boko Haram, yeah, which has now morphed into Islamic State in the West Africa province, Ansaru, etc. What really happened? What happened to our military at the core? And just take some time and unpack it for us. What happened to our military that they were not able to just deal with Boko Haram when it was a little growth, and now it's become a cancer in our society?
Hmm. Well, I will start by saying it would be a mistake to kind of point fingers at the Nigerian military and say that your incompetence alone is to blame for this jihadist threat kind of metastasizing, like you said, because insurgencies are a challenge for every military organization. If you go to staff colleges across the world today, the kind of, you know, the kind of syndicated sessions you see, most of them are typically geared at warfare between states, right? And warfare that involves units of one size, say a battalion, and how that battalion can potentially hold its own against not just an opposing battalion, but against a formation up, so i.e. a brigade, right? So these are the kinds of things that we're looking at in kind of military syndicated sessions. What you see less of, and what we've seen less of historically within military training, is this idea that a military force has to effectively become a police institution, right, and police territories against insurgents. Military men are very poor policemen. They don't want to do that job, and they aren't great at doing it. Except that's exactly what you need to be in a counterinsurgency, right? You need to effectively wear the hat of a policeman and kind of think along the lines of, well, the people attacking us are all part of the community, right? And so this isn't we in counterinsurgency kind of training, we look at it this way. Body counts are a perverse measure of success because in counterinsurgency math, if you have 10 people and you kill 9 rebels, you don't have 1 left. You have potentially 100 left because each of those 9 people you killed, guess what? They have brothers, Patrick. They have family, they have friends, they have people who are sympathetic. They have people who would take up arms on the strength of the fact that you've killed their loved ones. And so now you have even more people to fight. And I think that this is something that hasn't really seeped into the psyche of a Nigerian military that has always had an ammunition mentality. Back to the Civil War of Nigeria, it wasn't about better tactics per se. It was really about being better equipped. In fact, they were very, brash about this, that look, in this war, the force with the biggest and best equipped battalions is going to win. And that force was the Nigerian army. The Biafran army couldn't really compete in that sense, right? So you win that war, and this is what I argue in my first book, Counter-Insurgency in Nigeria, is that, look, if you look at the military institution in Nigeria, and you see how they won the Civil War of Nigeria, being able to move their 3 maneuver divisions over a space of about 2.5 years, and eventually defeat the rebels decisively, right? Using artillery, infantry, and armor, right? So the 3 main combat arms, and with the Air Force, of course, in support, and the Navy as well. You then understand why they developed this culture that really sees, the same arms, so artillery, infantry, Navy, really heavy spending, right, as the backbone of military success. Except these things don't really matter to an insurgent that is never going to engage you on the battlefield, right? When you have a group
It's
like
very
Boko Haram,
decentralized and mobile. Yeah.
decentralized, mobile, Patrick, but also these guys have taken war avoidance to the next level. They've given war avoidance a new meaning, right? Whereby you are there camped waiting for an enemy attack, and you are camped for days or even weeks, right? And the enemy doesn't show up the way expected. Guess what? They send a bunch of pregnant women who are supposedly going to bring you army supplies, and then they get to your gate and then they blow themselves up. right? And that's when it really hits you. Meanwhile, all this time, your men are they are twitchy, right? They be people, military personnel, they really struggle doing nothing, just playing cards, and that's not really what they were trained. They want to be active, right? So on top of being so twitchy, you then refuse to give them what they expect. It's a very difficult fight. That's not the only reason why they aren't winning the war. There are quite a few reasons. Welfare, again, is one of them. Patrick. And on this issue of welfare military spending, let me kind of talk more broadly about, something that's been thrown around a lot, where, oh, Nigeria is the biggest economy in Africa, or something along those lines, etc. But what I always tell my students when I used to be a professor was that, look, you don't look at, things like GNI or a country's gross, right? You don't look at it in kind of absolute terms. You need to look at it in terms of, per capita spending.
Exactly.
Right. So if you have 200 million people and they have to share, I don't know, 1 trillion, guess what? They might not have as much as a country that only has a GNI of say 1 million, but only has 2 people. Do you see what I mean? There's so many of us in Nigeria. And when over all these decades, you have politicians, I don't want to go into the corruption debate, but when you have everyone who can possibly be in a position of government, they then start this, or rather, I won't say start, but basically continue this tradition of embezzlement. What do you think then happens to the institutions that are meant to benefit from those funds? As I always say, the bill comes due. The bill comes due. If you have $100 million at your defense budget, right, and out of that $100 million, you end up embezzling, say, 90 million, and you only have 10 million for your troops. The bill comes due. When those troops are deployed to the battlefield, how well do you think they're going to do, right? Not only in terms of personal welfare, they don't have enough bullets, they don't have the proper ammunition, etc., etc. The bill comes due, Patrick. So what we're facing in Nigeria is a due bill that's many decades in the making.
I mean, you're right on the mark on this one. And again, still continuing the discussion on Boko Haram, I'd like to understand, because you touched on this in one of your books, that whole Chad Basin ecosystem that underscores how the porous borders and ethnic ties have made it difficult for us to basically solve the insurgency problem, and how terrorists, jihadists are able to cross between our borders, Cameroon, Niger, Chad, etc. What has led to this failure? What has led to the failure of these governments building up the right structure to protect the borders? And what can they do to at least stop the cross-border raids that happen in those border regions and then spread inwards into the country?
Again, a very good question. So the governments there's a few things the governments might be able to do to stop cross-border ingress and egress. But what they would be unable to stop is the cultural links between both sides, because you need to understand, Patrick, that these borders are artificial. I was reading the biography of Ahmadu Bello the other day, and one of the vignettes he introduces in his book is this idea that when Nigeria was amalgamated and they kind of drew those borders, that one of the borders came through a local market and even went through someone's kitchen, right? So, and I guess the point he was trying to make is that, and he then said right afterwards that, the people on both sides, they just continued as if no border existed, right? So this thing we call Nigeria, actually on the cultural ties, the ties between someone in the northeast of Nigeria and Chad or Niger, for instance, might be, you would expect to be much closer than the ties between someone in Borno and someone in Abakaliki. Exactly. Do you see what I mean? Exactly. And I might say this, and people might say, "Oh, Manny, you're not a true preacher." No, I'm just trying to point out that the ties are stronger. The ties are stronger, just the same way as many folks in the southeast of Nigeria have stronger ties with across the Cameroonian border as well, right? In rivers and what have you. So these cultural ties make it easier for these groups to kind of gain traction in these cross-border areas. So you might, you might hear people say, well, this is now a regional problem. Well, it's regional if you look at it in the sense that Nigeria, Niger, Chad are all different countries. But if you kind of zoom in into this region, right, and you kind of take a closer look at, okay, the cultures and, the traditions of these people, not just the religion, cultures and traditions, you would see that they have very close ties. So is for a lot of them, it's not really going from Nigeria to Niger. It's just going to meet someone who is your kinsman, more or
In my
less.
mother's village.
Exactly that, along those
Yeah.
lines. So this kind of makes it, intelligence sharing then becomes tricky in these instances. And it then becomes easier to point fingers. I remember conducting interviews in Borno some time back, and one of the not ever going to mention names, but one of the senior DSS personnel there, really, really, really sharp guy, was just talking about how the Boko Haram insurgency is essentially a cannery insurgency at its
I
heart.
saw that in the book. Yep.
Yeah, but look, I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. I think that initially the kind of disquiet and the discontent that came from Muhammad Yusuf's death might have been linked to these kind of ties of kinship, but I think it's evolved since then. There's lots of other factors we need to consider now.
But how do we deal with that, though? I mean, if they have a strong ethnic, not even religious in this sense, ethnic recruitment base, right? So how do you deal with that, especially in a place where the people feel like the government has little to no impact in their lives? These guys are beginning to hold territory and provide some sense of governance, provide some sense of social services to the people. How do you fight that? How do you unlodge or dislodge people who are now seen as really the effective government in place?
I think there's two maybe ways to look at that issue and try resolve it. Is one is to so part of the thesis I present in my second book is this idea that I kind of present a demand curve, and I argue that look, the higher the kind of the more insurgent groups demand from their followers and their potential adherents, the harder it is to get those folks to buy into those demands, right? So you've got that demand curve. So at the bottom, you kind of have a demand that says, you know what, just stay in your house, do nothing, just agree with us that Nigeria's government could do much better than it currently is, right? At that level of kind of passive action, a lot of people will buy in, right? But as you go higher up that curve, let's say the next level up is, okay, you don't just stay at home, you need to actually come to a meeting and agitate. Fewer people will show up at that meeting, Patrick. If the next level up is, well, you know what, you need to formally come to us and take training, even fewer people. And at the very top is suicide bombing, right? How many people do you think would willfully, right, ceteris paribus, give their lives up for a cause? Much fewer than would stay at home and say, yeah, the Nigerian government is rubbish. So I guess the reason I'm saying this is that if that's the case, then a government needs to improve the environment where these guys try to recruit. Right? There's a reason why it is typically the disenfranchised that fight these wars. I'm yet to see a rebel army composed of billionaires' kids. When you have so much going on for you in life, just I guess tied to this is also what we call biographical availability, right? It's more likely to join a rebel group if you are young, you are angry, you are disenfranchised. It becomes harder when, let's say, you are now in your 50s, right? You've got kids you've to send to school. You'll think twice, like, do I really have to do this?
Yeah.
Right. So I guess from this view, a government can try to make fewer people biographically available for an insurgency. And I think the Nigerian government in this regard has so much more to do, right? Because there's almost nowhere you go to in Nigeria, Patrick, where you won't see extreme poverty. And I mean extreme poverty. And people who are very, very poor and who crucially don't really have a viable pathway for social mobility, they become desperate, And desperate people do desperate things, as I'm sure you know.
Exactly.
So it's not just that these people necessarily buy into Boko Haram's ideology. In fact, I've written so much on the nuances of trying to just assume that everybody who fights for Boko Haram is ideologically inclined. No, that there's all kinds of ways they recruit, right? They abduct children, for instance, right? They also kind of recruit drug addicts and then say, look, if you fight for us, you'll get your fix. Do you know that for a drug addict, nothing is more appealing if you tell them that, if you do X, Y, Z, we'll give you a fix. They will do whatever you want. You see what I mean? So there's lots of mechanisms for recruitment. It's not just ideology. And all these mechanisms, whether it's poverty, whether it's drug abuse, so substance abuse, as the small correctly said today, all these things can be addressed by good governance.
Fantastic. Now let's switch hats and think about solutions here. And every new Inspector General of Police, who gets appointed, announces a flurry of changes to the force, from telling Nigerians don't ever give a bribe, all of that kind of stuff. They announced they're going to remove all the roadblocks, and 2 weeks later the roadblocks are back, and so on and so on and so forth. There's been so many national police reform strategies, etc. Why haven't these things worked? If you were to crystallize it for our audience, what are the reasons why all of this effort by smart people, you may have also been involved in some of these conversations, why haven't we been able to reform the force to be effective in policing the country?
I mean, if I were going to give one, because I tend to kind of, instead of saying, well, there's 15 things, let's kind of unpack this into a single main core issue. I think the single issue here, Patrick, is welfare. I keep coming back to this.
Okay.
If you go to our police colleges, I don't know if you've been to any police college recently.
I know a few.
It's
inhuman.
The conditions are just atrocious.
Inhuman, yeah.
Are just atrocious. I remember going to, because I make friends with security personnel at all levels. So one of my friends was actually and I know this is the military, but it's similar, right? One of my friends was a private soldier, and I liked playing with his kid a lot, a boy. And so but I never actually played with his son at their house, right? So I said, you know what, I want to see where you live today. And so we went together to his house. And when and I told him, I said, Charles, you never told me this is how, and he said, Ogana, so he said this is where we are. And I almost wept, Patrick, because I'm saying to myself, so this guy who goes around and still tries his best every day is forced to live like an animal. Right? And if you bring that to the police situation, like I argue in my book, you've got a police college where a dozen people, in some instances, are made to share like a small fish, right, with Gary. So you look at things like that, and so how are 12, adults going to share fish with Gary, walk away and be full? So these guys, they are hungry, they are angry, they are frustrated. Their salaries don't stretch to any level. Meanwhile, they see civilians who are driving these. And look, I'm not saying that this justifies police attitude. It doesn't. But I'm saying you need to remunerate these men and women properly. Right? Whatever it is you are planning, or your state police plans, you need to think about the policeman or woman as an individual, as a person, right? That's requires dignity, right? If a policeman or policewoman dresses up in the morning, Patrick, and goes to their station and they feel dignified, don't you think they will treat other people with dignity? If you don't feel dignified, if you don't feel heard, if you feel disenfranchised, right, then you would take umbrage. You basically have a very low threshold for tolerance. So the welfare question is so important. I can't stress this enough. Right, but when you have, and I don't want to go off in too much of a tangent, but when you have a kind of legislature that's bloated, you have so many people earning so much money, while you have people in the front lines earning just a pittance, some salaries of our legislators can pay, entire police units. And I'm saying hundreds of them. So how is that even fair? So police welfare, I think, and that welfare would also include things like, emotional support as well. For instance, and I'm sure you hear this almost every other day, that there was a police shooting, the police shot this person. What do you think happened when those guys, it's not like in the West where you go for desk duty, then you go see a shrink, who talks to you, how is this affecting you? No, 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 no. You are involved in that incident and you are just, you're put back on the streets. After you potentially kill someone, or you've seen someone be killed, or you saw. So how do you think that affects you? All these are things that we've not given enough thought to, the fact that these are men and women. They aren't just numbers. And it's really important we look critically at their welfare. I can't really endorse any measures until the welfare question is a part of that conversation.
And I mean, I feel your pain, and it's something I know personally. Just drive by or visit any police installation, or even just go to a police station to lodge a complaint or to free someone from there, and the squalor they live in is completely inhuman. But this cannot be new knowledge to the people who are supposed to solve it, the IGP, the Police Service Commission, etc. There is no great insight here that the Nigerian police is suffering from just sheer neglect. Why is it that we haven't been able to take this on as one issue and address it? And it's not like the ideas for addressing it are not known. So what is the critical challenge? Why we're not able to address this issue from your research, from your engagement?
I think so. There's two points I'll reach here. The first is that Nigeria, unfortunately, so we came out of the military interregnum in 1999, right? So that was when, and Boko Haram started about 2010. Well, a decade later, and then the year after that, they really started the insurgency. So I guess my point is, Nigeria only really had a decade of breathing room before kind of being plunged into another major crisis. And this then meant that the military were kind of seen as the priority, right, in terms of defense. So military spending is a subset of defense spending, right? Police spending will also be part of that package, right? But where you have basically the military chiefs making the argument that, look, we need to spend more because of this war, that kind of subordinates the police even more, right? So except the police should be, there's what we call stability operations. Stability operations are meant to be the bulk of the counterinsurgency, and it's the police that should run these stability operations, right? But because we don't really have that as the core of our counterinsurgency doctrine in Nigeria, the police still kind of play this subordinate role, right? Yes, there are liaison officers within military units, and there are component commanders, well, they used to be, but they still play a very marginal role. But they shouldn't. The police should play a key role. My point is, Patrick, that the police budget should be increased. It shouldn't be slashed, right? And that's kind of what we've been seeing. And we also have another problem here, which is, I think for the police force in Nigeria, I think that we've never really had an IGP that has taken this welfare question and has refused to let go of it, right? So instead of kind of focusing on improving what you already have, what we tend to see, Patrick, is that new police zones are created, right? Or new police formations are created, right? Or you have the SARS, the anti-robbery squad. Or, you have all these squads and special this and special that being created. Or you have a new helicopter unit being created, right? And the point is that when you have kind of these kind of police budgets, but the capital expenditures are tilted more towards equipment and what have you, and less towards kind of the welfare side, then you look at the budget and you say, well, hang on, that seems like a reasonable budget, but look, take a closer look and see how it was spent. So I think, I think this should be, the welfare question is one that really has to be at the heart of, the dispensing of the budget.
So I want to dig a bit deeper, right? Because this is at the heart of this whole development discourse is like, really get into the heart of why this is not working and how do we solve it. So you mentioned the military, right? So let's assume, as is the case, that they've gotten a lot of money in their budgets, But if you also look at the military installations, they're no better than the police installations. If you look at military housing, it's a pigsty. You look at even the guys who are fighting Boko Haram, fighting the insurgencies, where they operate from, you won't place your dog in there, And these are people who are supposed to guard us while we sleep. They've received increased budgets, etc. I think you also touched on something, which is, the folks who are supposed to solve these problems, they see how deeply rotten the system is. Instead of rolling up their sleeves to do the hard work, what do? They create separate special squads, special units to solve the problem. We see that not just in the military, not just in the police, but even in our bureaucracy. So you're appointed as chief executive of parastatal, an organization. You look at the quality of the people. There are good people in there, but we have paid them peanuts, and this is what we're getting, right? But instead of addressing that, what do? We create consultant teams, project implementation, this and that in the office of the CEO, and we don't spend enough time building the plumbing, of these organizations. How do we become a successful nation if we keep kicking the can down the road? If we keep avoiding the hard work that we need to do, and we look for these quick fixes, this ad hoc thing in the police, in the military, in the bureaucracy, are we not just postponing the doomsday? I know it's a lot in there.
Oh, but all of it is relevant. Look, I don't want to be one of those people who are outside Nigeria who are critical of the Nigerian government and critical of because because the question is, well, what are you doing to address? Well, in my case, I know what I'm doing.
I think you're doing your bit. You're thinking about it. You're writing about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess, look, it comes down to, leadership as well, right? If you had a Nigerian parliament or Nigerian upper house, House of Assembly and Senate that had senators and assemblymen and women who look at their constituents and only focus on the interests of their constituents, and if you multiply that across the entire house, you would have a very different country. Right now, we don't really have that. We don't have a legislature where people are committed to their constituents. Because that is really because if that's the case and you're committed to the constituents, then when you go back there, they would hear these problems that you and I are talking about here. They would know that the police station, on XYZ road is understaffed. They would know that there's a mobile police unit at the other end of town, but actually they don't have any tear gas. And so if there's a riot, they can't actually respond. That's what a good, I think, lawmaker, these are the kinds of issues, but we don't really see that. The leadership issue in Nigeria has never really been fixed, right? Going back all the way to 1966 and the coup d'etats, and we all saw what happened, even after the first coup that got rid of Balewa and Sardauna and so many others, right? And you then had Ironsi. Ironsi had no business being in power. I write about this in Picking Sides, my forthcoming book, and actually there's an article for those interested where I really unpack. Ironsi was out of his depth, right? So you have, and then you then get rid of Ironsi and you put in Gowon, right? But then he's basically put into a wartime scenario almost immediately, right? And no one can be prepared for that, right? The point is you've had leaders who were either out of their depths, who were corrupt, or who were so facing challenges that were, aside from those they should be facing, so they couldn't actually battle what they should be battling, right? We've just had a real leadership challenge in Nigeria. If you notice, I'm really biting my tongue regarding the current leadership. I have my thoughts, but I will really bite my tongue today, Patrick. But leadership is an issue.
Omeni, we don't bite our tongue here. We let it loose. So if you've got something to say it. And I think you raise an important point. Yeah. If you really look at the core of what we're dealing with in the country, and I think Achebe told us this, it's purely and squarely a failure of leadership, right? But we haven't even really explored it enough to see that almost every leadership team and group we've had in Nigeria from independence to date has been out of their depth. All of them. Yeah. I mean, you stopped at Gowon. He was young. He had a power base around him. He was just a mere puppet, and he danced to the tune. You go from there to even Mutala, who presented himself as, being the strong man. He was completely bereft of the intellect to deal with, the issues that Nigeria faced. We moved on from there to an Obasanjo who at that time, is not the Obasanjo we have of today. He was still out of his depth at the time, but was, a cut above the rest. He really was intellectual, associated with Nigeria's young intellectuals at the time, had a few good ideas. Then you move to Shagari, who was, like a zero nobody, and on and on and on and on till date. But the question is, why do we have these people emerging at the top? We had 2023, we had the options, we picked what we picked. Why is it that we end up with these choices? Now, that's the first question. The second question, is it really the people we pick, or is it a reflection of us? Is it that as a people, this is who we are? We are not deep intellectual people. We are not people who interrogate situations to come up with, options. I mean, you can see with our religion, we believe in magic. We believe that somebody will do the work for us, or some celestial power will do the work for us. Isn't this at the core of what's rotten in Nigeria, that the people themselves are not up to scratch with what it takes to exist and live in the 21st century?
Well, look, I mean, this whole idea of kind of getting someone else to do a lot of your legwork for you, it just means that you would never really improve in the areas you need to, right? And we kind of see that, and I don't want to make a flippant analogy, but we kind of see that with NATO today, whereby the US had kind of been picking up the slack for all these years, and now you've got the great presidents who have said, well, no, I don't want to do it anymore, and you can see NATO scrambling. Right. So if you kind of tease that into the case of Nigeria, whereby we've always sought for other people to come and help us, whether it's the IMF funds or whether it's, like you said, the supernatural, right? But I don't think that these are sensible ways to really look at self-help and self-development. I'm not sure that it's. I know people say things like, "Oh, well, you get the leaders you deserve." I don't think Nigerians deserve their leadership. You said we are uncocked. Okay, so let me uncock and say I don't think Nigeria deserves the kind of leadership it's had all this time. Still want to be diplomatic there, but look, I think part of the issue again is not. It's welfare, except now I'm leaning more towards education, right? Because if you have people who are educated, who are really educated, and if you have people who have livelihoods, then the lines along which they vote would be a reflection of their mind, of their understanding. They no longer vote using their stomach, right? As I'm sure you've seen, you might have a democratic rally holding where people are genuinely trying to agitate against an issue that means something to them. But then you see a counter rally made up of touts. And those touts are only there because they've been paid, right? They are not there because there's any kind of intellectual link between their actions and what they personally believe, right? And it's a bit sad. I think we really need a country to think and act along the lines of, how can we make things better for everyone? Not along the lines of how do I, increase how do I get an alert of 50K today?
Let's get back to security reforms, right? And we've made various attempts at police reforms. And what patterns do you observe in these efforts? And what lessons can we learn from past failures that current policymakers may wish to consider as they engage in putting together new reforms? I mean, I suspect that some group of people are sitting somewhere thinking through how do we reform the police force? How do we fix the military? How do we fix our intelligence agencies and so on? But we've done these things a million times in the past. In your engagement with this topic, what are some patterns? What are some lessons that these policymakers, good or bad, failures or successes, can really leverage to see if we can find a way forward?
I think I'll take both examples from the police force, since that seems to be the main central theme today. And one would be a positive, and one would be an kind of a adverse lesson. The positive would be the anti-robbery squads, right? Introduced, and I talk about this in my book, like in my third book, Policing and Politics in Nigeria. Introduced in the 1990s. They were extremely effective. I interviewed some of these guys, and I mean the actual pioneer anti-robbery squad commanders, and you could see how proud they were, right, of the work they did to actually, end groups like Anini, for instance, in Benin, Notorious, and Iyamu, who was meant to also be, who was a police officer, but was one of the bad eggs there. And so these anti-robbery squads, made up of decent, hardworking policemen, they actually managed to not only root out the ones that were rotting from amongst them, but also end the kind of robbery menace, right? So that's something to really take away, like going back there to say, okay, how did we select these individuals? How were they effective? How did we enable them, right? Because frankly, we still have, I think armed robbery is still a major issue in Nigeria.
Yeah.
As is banditry, kidnapping, and what the army can't be expected to take on these roles. It is the police. It is the police that should be central, because a lot of these people, well, all of them, well, most of them, Patrick, are Nigerians, right? Maybe some of them come from across the border, but a lot of these kidnappers and what have you, they're Nigerians, right? And this means they have kin, they have family, there's potentially, ways that people can inform on them, right? But nobody will speak to a police force that they think is corrupt, they think is inept, they think is murderous, etc., etc. So policing is such a good part of a stable, security environment. And we really need to pay more attention to that. In terms of, one of the more adverse lessons, NSAS, and, that the whole idea that, this robberies, anti-robbery squads that were so successful came to be so perverted, to the point where sometimes they stop you asking for money. If you say you don't have any money, do you have your card? Yeah, they actually have POS machines. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, who does that? Why would you have your point of sale machine as a policeman? That just tells me that you are there to not to take care of the people, but to effectively extort. And so that was a horrible lesson, and something that I was really, encouraged about was the NSAS riot. This idea that, and it maybe Nigerians haven't quite reached breaking point yet, Patrick, but NSAS was as close as we've come in quite a while.
Interesting. I mean, it's difficult to see how to unpack these issues without always coming back to leadership, right? But I'm thinking, are there other things that we were blindsided by because we have this, shining leadership or failure of leadership in our faces? Is there something else? I know that many of the issues take root from bad leadership, but we understand that, we haven't mentioned the corruption word that much in this conversation. But are we not are there other things we're not paying attention to because we're really focused on bad leadership, corruption, etc.? Is there something else that we're missing?
I think it's just really about trying to get the message out there that if every Nigerian is a decent human being, right? They have a rectitude base, they have a moral compass, they feel a sense of duty towards the person on their right and their left. If every Nigerian can do that, we would be one of the most powerful nations on the planet.
But that's
Right.
not possible, though. That's not possible in human
That's that's where I'm going with this part. I said if we could do that. Now, part of the reason why that's not possible is because for you to encourage people to not be corrupt, you need to have alternatives for them. Right? So it's very difficult to kind of put this message out there to say, please don't take bribes, don't ask for bribes, don't be when their salaries are incapable of feeding their families, right? So it all comes back to the things we've talked about: leadership, wealth. All these things are connected. But look, until Nigerians also gradually start changing the mindsets, right, about not wanting to demand bribes, not wanting to give bribes, But I know that's easier said than done, Patrick. I
Very
know
easier said than done. I mean, how do you
because of
say
the
no
kind of
when there's a
environment.
gun pointing to your face?
Yeah, yeah. I know it's much easier said than done, and that's why I said if we could do that, and to gradually make that if to become a maybe to become we can definitely do this. It will take changes in these areas we've talked about, the leadership, and also a closer look at welfare, not just the welfare of the military and the police, but welfare across the board. Because a lot of those people who take guns and go and rob, you need to look at their backstory. What made a decent boy, right, who might have been a valedictorian in their secondary school, what made that person eventually feel that his life was so hopeless that he, meets a policeman, gets a Kalashnikov from them, forms a gang and starts robbing. What led them down the path? It's a research question, but it's also a real life question as
I
well.
think I think it's a question that the philosopher Tupac Shakur asked, that we should ask how did the boy, the gun get into the hands of the boy? As we build more prisons and we plan to lock him up, So it's a question we need to ask also in Nigeria. But a question I want to focus on a bit more is the military, So what's your view on Nigeria's counter-insurgency framework? Given, I mean, some of our numbers show that we're winning in some areas, but given that we're not seeing the kinds of successes we would like to see, what are your thoughts on how we rethink, reshape, refund our counterinsurgency? Given that the forces that we're fighting are very decentralized and mobile, should we be looking to create smaller, decentralized mobile units to confront them versus using the Nigerian army as currently constituted? What are some of your thoughts in this area?
So these are the things I unpack in my second book in particular. This idea that it's not just about having a solution that's viable on paper, Patrick, may not be viable in practice if you don't put in the right kind of components to make it work. We initially started with the joint task force approach, which is useful. The joint task force essentially has personnel from the different service branches, so the Army, Air Force. I think there were some SBS folks there as well, a police component commander. And then you have the prison service was also there in Bornu, especially for the Giwa Barracks detention facility. You had the DSS as part of this. So all these guys working in close tandem together really proved to be quite effective. And I saw some really extraordinary things. Like I saw for the first time as a Nigerian in my life, actually, I saw a police commander commanding army troops in Borno State. And you could see that they really respected him because it was a sense that we are all in this together. And there was a police component commander in JTF Operation Restore Order, right? But that whole thing collapsed because I don't want to go into the politics of it. You had this army commander come in who really wanted to dismantle the Joint Task Force. He really wanted it dismantled because he really felt he wanted to take charge of it. He took charge. The whole thing got dismantled, takes charge, doesn't fare very well. All right, we try a different approach, which is the small or rather mobile teams you were talking about, right? So mobile strike teams, the MSTs as they called. Now, a mobile strike team is meant to be able to get from A to B very quickly, right? It's meant to be able to hit as hard as a brigade, but be much smaller than a battalion in practice, right? Nigerian mobile strike teams never had the capacity to hit even as hard as a battalion, but they could still hit hard. But the issue here was that they were critically undermanaged, right? A mobile strike team, if you think about it, Patrick, should have functional vehicles, right? So what happens when a mobile strike team doesn't have functional vehicles? It doesn't function.
It's
right.
not
And so although the idea was brilliant on paper, right, that issue of logistics, and I really break down the logistics issue, right? Like the cars and the forward repair bases and the rearward repair bases, why they didn't talk well properly to each other, and what the challenges were that manifested in mobile strike teams themselves. Right, all that is something that really caused the demise of the MSTs. So they went from the MSTs to the super camps approach. Super camps is essentially you building a huge camp, right? And putting all your military personnel there. So while mobile strike teams are meant to disaggregate military resources, super camps are meant to aggregate military resources. And the argument there is that a super camp is a very hard target. It's impossible to penetrate. And you're exactly right. It'll be hard to penetrate a target like that. But guess what? When you have so many troops cooped up somewhere, all the enemy has to do is attack everywhere else that doesn't antagonize the base itself.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So we have all these approaches, and so there's I think scope to really make improvements overall. And I quite like the idea of mobile strike teams, and maybe it could have worked much better given more time and more support. But we'll never know.
So let me dig just one level deeper. So it shows that there are smart people who are thinking about these, ideating, trying different things to see what works. Why is it that when they don't work, it doesn't seem to me like we take the lessons from the failures and use that to improve the next idea that we come up with? So, for instance, the gentleman who you kind of named in passing, who wanted to control. We should have seen that in our history, that people trying to build these fiefdoms and have massive control over systems have been a core reason why things have failed. Why wasn't there enough pushback against that to see that this initiative worked as designed? Do you have a thought on that?
Well, I think in that particular instance, the reason why there wasn't enough pushback is because we kind of went with a band-aid solution. This was kind of leading up to the elections 2014, and the whole thing of Boko Haram really running rampage around the same time that Daesh, the Islamic State, were running rampage in Mosul, in Iraq. And so we had our own situation there in Nigeria. And so we kind of turned outward to mercenaries, right? So the South Africans, there was that whole, fiasco of South African mercenaries coming to support our troops. And the Band-Aid solution worked because we recovered a lot of that territory. And so you kind of then that again goes back to what we said earlier, is that when you go to someone else to kind of solve your solutions, right, you've not really built the institutional capacity to solve them yourself, right? And a Band-Aid solution is exactly that. It's temporary, right? You might disperse the enemy, but the enemy would, reconstitute itself and keep being an enduring threat. And I think that that's what we've maybe seen, is that because that solution worked, we didn't really, think about the lessons of the collapse of the Joint Task Force that came just before then. I think it was a real shame about the Joint Task Force and that whole thing, collapsing. There was a Christmas I spent in Maiduguri, and there wasn't a single suicide bombing, and that was because of those guys. But I think those days are now behind us. So I think certainly there should be kind of a sense that, lessons should have been learned. What were those lessons? How do we extract them? I try to extract as many of those lessons as possible in my books. And I try to say, hey, this is what worked. This is what we could have kept doing. This is what didn't work, etc. And I think a lot of these kind of, lessons are gradually being filtered into the military institution.
And I can't recommend your books, enough to anybody who's interested in this topic, because it's really a deep, insightful ways of looking at the issues and profiling, solutions that could work. And that leads me to another question, which is, should we be, if we've tried these different things, should we be negotiating with Boko Haram to find a political solution to this issue, or has the horse left the barn, so to speak? That negotiations, even if you negotiated with Boko Haram now, it doesn't really solve the problem because the violence or violent conflict has become its own business, and negotiating with one particular group doesn't solve that much. Or what are some of your more practical ideas on how we deal with the different segments of violent conflicts we have? Terrorism, and here I'm looking at Boko Haram and Saru, ISWAP, banditry, which has no leaders, basically, farmer header issues. Can we get into some of the nitty-gritty ideas on how to begin to solve these different segments of violent conflict in Nigeria?
I'll start from the last one, the farmer header issues. Look, I think for that particular challenge, I think there's an environmental component that's not been part of the conversation, and I think that it should be.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go back to Northeast Nigeria in the 1980s and look at the levels of rainfall and look at the level of the Lake Chad, and you kind of compare those levels to where we are today, it's like night and day. All
Mm-hmm.
right, so there's far less precipitation there. The Lake Chad, which is meant to be a water body that's effectively impossible to cross from any 2 points, is now crossable by land at several sections, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a real issue around the environmental crisis, as it's called across the world in Nigeria. Now, let me link that to the farmer header crisis. You have a situation whereby for generations, these herders have always taken their cattle through ancestral routes, right? And those ancestral routes have always been enough to sustain the cattle.
Mm-hmm.
Today, they aren't enough, which is why they've now had to go through people's farmyards, through routes that are unfamiliar to them. Sometimes you might see a head of cattle in a very odd location, and you're saying to yourself, is he lost? What's he doing here?
In
Okay,
cities.
so
Mm-hmm.
and part of the reason, no, he's not lost. He had a predetermined route to take. It's just that route basically wasn't bringing in enough supplements for his livestock, right? So you then have a situation, and obviously for the farmers, they are not having people come through with cattle to their farms because they are also facing the same challenge, right? They don't have the same kind of outputs that they used to. Their produce is smaller, etc., etc. Right, so you have these, major clashes that happen as a result. And I think on the one hand, you can, take a more agrarian heavy policy whereby you kind of look at the farmers to say, how can we help you, get better farming practices back in order. But you also need to look at the headers themselves and say, right, these are the ancestral routes you used to take. They're not viable anymore, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that you can take these alternative routes, right? So you can think of setting up ranches, you can think of alternative routes, but it has to be the problem has to be viewed from an environmental perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
The solution can't simply be these guys are having clashes, deploy the army.
Mm-hmm.
That can't be the answer to everything, Patrick.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because these folks are also fellow Nigerians. Now, you might look at the cattle rearer and say, "Oh, but he's a Nigerian. Given the right opportunities, that person rearing his cattle, he might be in this chair instead of me."
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we should treat them like human beings. And this brings me to another point, and this is not a tangent. This is very much at the part of this conversation. We need to treat human life with respect in Nigeria.
Exactly.
I'm sure if there are lots of Nigerians in the chat, I'm sure every one of us would have come across a corpse on the
Mm-hmm.
road at some point.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen them growing up in Nigeria, we used to see corpses,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not right. That's not right. Like if there was a corpse, well, you would never see a corpse in the Western country. You just wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
You need to treat human life with respect. When the Boko Haram crisis first started in 2009, and President Yaradua was he was visiting Brazil late July 2009, and he was on the tarmac. Actually, he was on the plane. He was climbing to go into the plane, and they informed him that look, 600 people have been killed in this crisis. He saw rest in peace. I am not here to denigrate anyone, but the man smiled, waved, and continued on to Brazil. He said it was under control. Patrick, if 10 people get killed in the UK and Keir Starmer, even two get killed in the UK and Keir Starmer is in a different country, he cut short his trip and
Correct.
comes right back to this country
Mm-hmm.
to find out what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to say that Yaradua remained in Brazil even as the riots escalated, as we both know, and even more people were killed.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't cut short his trip.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that, and if you see that from the president of a country whereby, fellow countrymen and women are being killed on the streets, and I'm not saying in small numbers, and they still embark on that trip, and even when things escalate, they refuse to come back. What does that tell you about our calculus of human life, Patrick?
Mm-hmm.
And this links me back to the kind of header who might be seen as a nobody or but that's wrong. That man has the potential to be anything he wants to be if we support him. You know, so this value of human life, you know, both literally in terms of, you know, people, you know, respect to those who've been killed, but also to support those who are still alive. I
So,
think it's
question
also
for you.
something that should be part of our conversation.
Yeah. In your research, did you ever ask the question why these headers have not opted for the ranching option? You know, we've studied this. We know that the routes, some of them, farmers have encroached on them. You know, some, because of the drought situation in Nigeria, you know, they don't have enough pasture on them. You know, why haven't they opted for the various ranches that are in northern Nigeria to go back there, work with their governors and state authorities to replant them and have their cattle grow in those ranches and then transport them either by trucks or as live animal or in whatever form to the rest of the country? And that would kind of ratchet down the violence that we're seeing in all parts of the country. Did that come up in any of the conversations?
I think part of what I found in looking at that particular question is, regrettably, we're still in a position in Nigeria where a lot of the policies that are implemented on paper, in practice, they would only affect you depending on who you know. See what I mean? And so while it might seem that it would be easy to get your cattle relocated to a ranch, or while it might seem that you could in a relatively straightforward way, get access to subsidies to kind of help you feed your cattle, that again becomes a political quagmire, right? And this then brings me to a very key point, Patrick, is that if things are so difficult, right, that a lot of people, instead of doing them the right way, end up doing them the wrong way, right? How do we then make things less difficult so that people end up doing things the right way? So, for instance, and this is a parallel example. Let's say you are driving from A to B, and you have to you happen across a police checkpoint, right? And the police tell you, look, if you don't give us 500 naira, you are not going for your meeting. We are going to detain you. Yeah. And so to basically stop to prevent a scenario whereby you miss your meeting, you just give them the money and you continue on your journey. Right? Because they've made it so hard for you to do the right thing that doing the wrong thing is now easier. So in these scenarios, Patrick, we should ask ourselves, how can we make it more difficult for, you know, these kind of wrong scenarios to manifest? These are all questions, and it's at all levels, whether it's, you know, the council office in Gwagwalada in Abuja that allows people who are trying to head their cattle, that allows easier access to funding. So instead of you going to meet someone, who you simply go to that council office and it's a straightforward process. There's no red tape. You go there, you get the money. But if it's the case that if you come here to get the money, you need to go speak to that Oga. When you go and speak to the Oga, you'll say, okay, you need to come back tomorrow, or make sure you bring 10,000 naira. So, and the cattle header doesn't have that kind of money, so they might just not bother coming back. You see what I mean? So if it's possible to kind of make it easier to do the right thing, so people don't have to keep doing the wrong thing to get by, I think that might also be one of the key solutions we can look for.
Now, you talked about the Joint Task Force, and if we look at the multinational Joint Task Force, and again, here I'm looking at the cross-border issues, because conflict as we have it in Nigeria today is not just within the Nigerian territory. You know, it's kind of ebbs and flows between our neighboring countries. The multinational Joint Task Force has really struggled with inconsistent funding and, you know, maybe what we can even call political will. In your view, what are some structural reforms that could strengthen this regional initiative, and how might it avoid replicating the missteps that we had with our joint task force within Nigeria and also the Nigerian military? You know, what are some of the ideas you may have thought of?
I think I'm someone who is a bit dubious when it comes to multinational forces fighting insurgencies. I feel that insurgencies are local problems, and I feel that insurgencies really should emphasize the local elements. I mean, how did multinational joint task force work out for NATO ISAF in Afghanistan? They lost that war, didn't they? You know, so and they had orders of magnitude more resources than we do in Northeast Nigeria and those environments. I guess my point is, we shouldn't put too much stock on a joint task force being a silver bullet in this instance. I think that these forces are useful for intelligence sharing, but I don't think that the emphasis should be kind of making them the superordinate in these kinds of operations. I think again, you should look at the local militaries of all three countries and really look at, you know, having those militaries work with the local communities and police forces as well, especially because in these multinational joint task forces, you don't really have a policing component as well. And as I'm sure we've established, policing is so important in counterinsurgency.
Interesting. The splintering of Ansaru and ISWAP, do you think that provides any strategic advantage for us, you know, in terms of leveraging it either for negotiations or for divide and conquer? You know, what are some thoughts you have on that issue as well?
This is the enemy of my enemy is my friend until he becomes my enemy again. Look, any respite might be temporary,
Okay.
right? We've generally in countries and kind of conflict scenarios where these groups kind of split, it never leads to a more stable situation. Never, right? Take Afghanistan, take Syria, take Libya. Right. In fact, some could argue that the more splits within these organizations, the more erratic they are, because you no longer have an overarching authority that can tell them, don't attack that town, don't attack these people. These are rules of operations, of engagement. You no longer have that kind of structure, honor amongst thieves, if you will. Right. And so I don't think we should rejoice too heartily about the fact that these groups are splitting up. It might lead to a bit more chaos. And I don't know that it will necessarily lead to more stability in the long term, especially if they can both manage to kind of remain functional and operational independently of each other.
Okay, so here's a question, and you know, it may require a bit of you may take some time to build out on it. Consider that you're Nigeria's security czar, right? And you have, or the president has bequeathed to you all the powers regarding security, internal security, whatever you need to do to fix it, right? If you were designing, say, a 10, 20-year security roadmap for the country, what are the maybe 2 to 3, 4 fundamental pillars that you're going to set this strategy on? And how would you sequence the implementation of this idea? Now, this is me thinking you get audience with President Tinubu and he says, I really want to get this done. I'm going to pull everybody under you. Just go figure out and come back to me with a plan that works. And he understands it's not going to work immediately. You know, maybe it's a 10-year period, 15, 20 maybe. What are some of the pillars you're going to build this strategy on, and what comes first, what comes next?
I mean, just off the top of my head, if you mentioned 4 pillars. So just if we're going to say if we're going to take this as a 4-point agenda, if you will, I would, as a matter of urgency, implement a comprehensive welfare review across the ranks in the military and across the ranks in the police force. And that welfare review is essentially going to find out what the average person at their rank needs to survive, right? And what they are being paid, right? Because I think, Patrick, that it's really important that we start remunerating our forces properly, right? And that welfare review would also include things that involve shooting incidents. If there were shooting incidents, then those folks need to be taken out, right? They need to make sure that we need to make sure that they have the proper support to ensure that when they are reintroduced, they are not unhinged or unstable. Right? There are lots of instances where people have had mental health challenges for a long time, they weren't addressed, and they end up shooting up their units. Both police personnel do this, army personnel also do this as well. Welfare review, first plank. The second plank would be training. I believe that training is not just important, it is critical. A well-trained force, Patrick, is a better force overall. And this isn't just about field training. It's also about classroom training. to help these folks understand what an insurgency is and why you can't fight it the way you've been trained to fight normal enemies in all your syndicated sessions, right? Training, I think, is really, really important. The third plank, I would say, is intelligence sharing. Being able to share intelligence between units laterally, but also between organizations, the police, the DSS, I think this is, but also across the nations as well, which is why the multinational joint task forcing can actually be used as a hub, right, to kind of aggregate information from these different countries. I think information intelligence sharing is really, really important. It could be the difference between launching an airstrike that kills innocent people or launching a strike that actually damages the enemy irreparably, right? And the final plank that I would say is that our organizations need to be leaner overall. I think that as with much of governance and bureaucracy, governance in Nigeria, there's a lot of bureaucracy that's unnecessary, right? And part of that comes from the fact that these organizations are bloated, unnecessarily so, right? You have, people who are occupying positions that overlap with several other people, right? And the opposite of that is that you also have units that are understaffed, right? So get rid of the the things that are causing the bloat, but also make sure that these units are well equipped.
And how do we inject like performance improvement, performance management within the force? Because one might even argue, there's the argument that we don't have enough people in the force, but one might argue that you may want to drop some people who are either untrainable, because ab initio they were untrainable, and then have a process of bringing in fresh blood. What are your thoughts on it? Especially because we've got this army of educated people, young educated people who are unemployed, but we have a force made up of, some of the people who may not ab initio have been the right people to join the force. Do you have any thoughts on this and what the pushbacks would be from the people you've engaged in the various interviews you've had?
I think training would be able to kind of address that issue you mentioned. Like from a well-designed training regimen would be able to identify those that are really at the top and those that maybe require more work and those that you can use. It's interesting we're kind of having this conversation because Heraclitus, the ancient Greek historian, says that out of 100 men in battle, 10 have no business being there.
Yeah.
Right. 80 are targets and they probably want to make it home. Right. 9 are the real warriors and we should be grateful to have them. But there's one person, the leader, the person who basically is unique on that battlefield. And if you equip and support that person adequately, he could potentially bring everyone home. Right. Now, this is important because the notion that in a battalion of, say, 800 troops, that everyone is the same is simply not true. You have people who are so far ahead of their peers in that battalion, they shouldn't even be in the same unit, right? But if you don't have the right training to identify these people to say, okay, this guy clearly doesn't belong here, he should be somewhere else, right? And these guys, well, this is what they need to improve, and on and on. If we don't have these kinds of structures, then we just keep kind of putting in people, square pegs in round holes, Patrick. That is the story of Nigeria, isn't it? You have the right people with the right ideas who never get to implement them. And you have people who have no business being where they are, and they end up being there for decades. Imagine the damage they do in those situations. So exactly. I think, coming back to performance management, I think that, first of all, you need to have a motivated force. And if we can kind of look at these 4 pillars that I mentioned, I believe that we can have a more motivated force, and then you can start measuring performance beyond to see how you can further improve.
I think we're approaching the end of this, and just any final thoughts from you, maybe something we didn't cover?
I just want to say, well, first of all, to thank you again for giving me this opportunity. And I want to say that, look, I have a lot of faith in Nigeria. I really, really do. It's not a coincidence that I'm constantly engaged and, trying to really understand how to redress the security challenges. And I believe that, things are going to get better. And it's conversations like this that are so critical in kind of, germinating the ideas that lead to activities that hopefully improve things that have troubled us for so long. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Omeni, for joining me on this conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today's episode of Development Discourse. We have a big discourse that's coming up at the same time tomorrow with Dr. Samuel Mayambo. He's the vice president at the World Bank, but more interestingly, a leading candidate for the presidency of the Africa Development Bank. I hope you find time to join us. We're going to share the link to that. But this is Development Discourse, big ideas, hard questions, real conversations. Until next time, it's Patrick Okigbo. Let's keep building that society we want to live in. Thank you, everyone.